Good afternoon to all of you. I have great pleasure in welcoming Dr. Vikram Chand, Senior Public Sector Management Specialist at the World Bank. Dr. Chand, we recently met, but we've been trying to reach him for a while in relation to discussing with him ideas about the development of our public policy school. And I was very pleased to spend some time with him over lunch discussing about the vision of our public policy school. And one thing which came up very clearly is his own strong commitment to India and his profound understanding of the problems of public policy within India. His recent book on the subject, published with the Oxford University Press, is also a testament to a strong, commitment, academic commitment, but also his scholarship in that field. There are very few people, both in India and around the world, who can combine both the strong academic credentials as well as distinguished public policy practitioners' work, which, as you can see from Dr. Chand's bio, it reflects that. So we're very fortunate to welcome him to campus. I hope that the students in the law school, the business school, and the international affairs school who are here can benefit from it, and hopefully from August onwards, occasions like this, we will have the students of public policy sitting. So without further ado, I'd like to thank Dr. Chand and welcome him to the campus.
Thank you, Raj, and thanks to all of you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me now just rig up this PowerPoint. And what schools? What schools are you from? All lawyers. Okay, I'm scared of lawyers. Lawyers are a dangerous lot. Yeah. But, anyway, I hope there's no sort of material for me to be sued in this presentation, but I think you'll find it fairly non-controversial from that point of view. Let me just mention that you're free to interrupt anytime you like. I don't mind. Let's start by just saying what this work is about. Basically, the work that I've done in this Oxford volume, we were trying to get a sense. Raj, how much time do I have? Roughly?
I think 35 minutes.
So. Yeah, okay, yeah. And I won't force you to listen to me for more than 30 minutes, I promise. But one of the things that we were trying to do was look at how does reform happen. I mean, I think in India, if you look at the Indian problematique in terms of reform, I think we have a fairly good idea of what reforms are needed. I don't think there's a lot of debate about the things we need to do. There is obviously a debate. I mean, I, for instance, favor FDI and multi-brand retail. There are others who would contest that. But it seems to me that that is a way to reduce leakages in the supply chain and cut food inflation. But there are people who dispute that. So you can have a dispute, but I think we know within a certain period of time what reforms have to take place if this country is to continue to grow at 8 to 10%. And I think that is the issue. If you're going to sustain 8 to 10% growth rates, you have to do certain things which haven't happened yet. Whether it's infrastructure reform, whether it's agricultural reform, whether it's labor reform, FDI in retail, this kind of thing. So the question is, how do we get there? And I think, in the last few months, what you've seen are strong objections from political parties to various reform proposals on grounds of federalism, grounds of assertion by regional parties and things like that. So it's a very tricky political environment. It's a tricky bureaucratic environment. And so it seemed to us when we did this work that figuring out how reform happens is a legitimate question, independent of the issue. So what we've done is we've pulled together some case studies and tried to sort of look at these case studies from the point of view of the how of the reform process. Now, let me just say that, some preliminary conclusions. Reform is mostly a messy affair, driven largely by contextual factors. It's an unpredictable process. There's a lot of trial and error, experimentation, even luck. And, the conclusion of this is that you can't come in with a prescription. It's very difficult to say this is a blueprint for reform and this is what you should do. And, because in fact, these blueprints from the outside in don't work. So you have to really search for homegrown solutions. what Claude Lévi-Strauss called bricolage. Bricolage is tinkering with different parts of the puzzle to recombine them. That to me seems to be a critical part of the reform process. Now my son, I just bought my wife an Apple phone, IS 4S phone, and I was thinking, my son, if he unpacks the phone and tinkers with it, even though I'll lose 43,000 rupees, it's not such a disaster because he might learn something about bricolage. He might learn something about recombining patterns, and it might facilitate his creativity. And don't laugh, because if you talk to the key designer for Apple, Sir Jonathan is what he's called, he used to spend his childhood taking apart machinery and putting it back together. And he became a fantastic designer. So, I hope my Apple phone isn't destroyed by my son, but if it is, I'll take it in my stride. Now, tinkering on the margin seems to me to be the preferred reform strategy in India. And we can debate this, but the virtue of tinkering is that the marginal cost of reform, it can be absorbed with each change. But beyond a certain point, after you've tinkered once, twice, thrice, 4 or 5 times, there's a qualitative systemic shift, and you're on a different level. At which point your sunk cost is very high. And when your sunk cost is very high, you can't actually withdraw from that. This idea is not original, it comes from Doug North. And, I think Doug North makes an excellent point. The trajectory of tinkering, as opposed to the more colloquial use of tinkering on the margin. Now, let me just get into some of the case studies. We looked at various case studies to sort of validate the framework on how reforms occurred. And in fact, we looked at 3 states. We looked at Bihar, we looked at Gujarat, we looked at West Bengal under the communists, the CPM. And, Bihar is a case of a poor state where you've had a dramatic acceleration of growth. Now, how many of you know what Bihar's growth rate was last year? GSDP growth rate. How many of you know what GSDP is? What is GSDP? What is GDP? So what is GSDP in the context of Bihar? Gross state domestic product. Now, how many of you know what the growth rate was?
It was, I can't exactly give the figure, but it was a teeny bit less than Gujarat's.
It was very good, excellent. It was about 11.3%, a teeny bit more than Gujarat.
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
Fantastic. What's your name?
Nilesh.
You're going places. What? Yeah.
Actually, he's going places.
He is going places. I'm deeply impressed here.
He comes from the place.
He comes from there. Okay. Well, I mean, I didn't have to know that. But, and then Gujarat, of course, consistently fast-growing state, buoyant industrial commercial sector, and West Bengal, reasonable growth record, trying to promote industry, middling growth record. Now, let me just give you a sense of these numbers, because the numbers are important. Average annual GSDP growth rate in Bihar from 1994 to 2003 was about 4.5%. Between 04-05 and 07-08, these are CSO figures, Central Statistical Organization figures, growth rate increases to 11.3%, higher than Gujarat's 11.1% in the same period, and West Bengal's 7.6%. In the 90s, Gujarat, by a long stretch, was the fastest growing state. Now, what happened in Bihar? I mean, never discount leadership. Reform was certainly pushed very hard by Nitish Kumar. But the point is, Nitish Kumar comes to power because of a shift in voter preferences. And these preferences shift largely because I think, the conventional explanation is right. Deep disillusionment with what preceded Nitish Kumar and a sense that the point of no return had been reached. And we could get into caste configurations and religious configurations and things like that to understand this, but I don't want to do that right now. Suffice to say that he was able to create a kind of all-inclusive tent where he was able to replace that majoritarian coalition that Lalu had put together, which gradually was frittered away. Now, immediately you see wide-ranging reforms. And let me just highlight two of these reforms. And before I do that, make a point. The Bihar government became hyperactive. Now, how many of you have read James Madison's work in the Federalist Papers? How many of you know what the Federalist Papers are? Nilesh?
Yeah, they were there's something roughly akin to our Constitutional Assembly debates, wherein they give their views on the various articles of the Constitution that were being framed at that point.
Very good, very good. Excellent. At the back, sir, you had a point?
Yeah, we
Speak up, shout.
Yeah, my elective is actually US constitutional law, and we have read Federalist Papers.
Yeah. Oh, good. Okay.
It was before all the states, the United States were coming together. People like James Madison and
Alexander
Hamilton, they got together and they were deciding as to how the constitution should be of such a federation and not a confederation.
That's great. Fantastic. Basically, the point is, the point here is that the Articles of Confederation was about gridlock. And Alexander Hamilton pointed out that what we needed was energy in the executive. And of course, we think of the government of Prime Minister Manmohan Singh today, you wonder, whether we have energy in the executive. I think that in fact is a major problem. And when you look at Nitish Kumar, one of the things Shehbal Gupta will tell you, who is head of the Asian Development Research Institute of Bihar, he says we have a 16-hour chief minister. There's a bit of hyperbole attached to that. But Nitish Kumar is full of energy, and he's active on a range of fronts. So this quality of energy in the chief executive is extremely important. So let me just note that first. Now, the second point that I'd like to make is two things happened. The first thing that happened was they tried to fix the rule of law. Now, how many of you have read Danny Roderick's work? One Economics, Many Recipes. One Economics, Many Recipes. If you haven't read it, read it. Because it's a fantastic analysis of how reforms should happen in practice. And it's surprisingly eclectic. And one of the errors in Danny's book, I think, is that he talks a little bit about binding constraints. And if you make a mistake, and you might think that law and order was the binding constraint in Bihar. And I think, in a sense, it was the binding constraint, but in a sense, maybe not. It was the most visible constraint at the time. Okay. Now, the issue here is that, Danny talks about this being the most visible binding constraint. I think it's the most visible problem, not necessarily the most binding. And Albert Hirschman, in a critique of Roderick, makes the point, well, in fact, US economists tended to project binding constraints onto cultures that they didn't know much about. So, if you went to Colombia, you might say this was the binding constraint based on a prior notion of what was missing in the US and project it. But that's a theoretical debate. I'm just urging you to read Danny Roderick's book, and if you don't have the library, order it. Now, in terms of law and order, what were some of the major shifts in Bihar? The first shift was prosecution of high-level criminals. And regardless of which party you belong to, criminals were arrested, prosecuted. The second thing was the adoption of a police act to reduce, basically to reduce interference in the police. And the third thing was better coordination among the judiciary, the police, and the local administration. And this I won't go into this because there are a lot of details about cybercrime, forensics, and things like that, cooperation in investigations, these sorts of issues. And a focus more on successful convictions. So, in the first term, at the end, you have 55,000 hardened criminals locked up. Now, that does make a difference. Which is why I was disappointed when Akhilesh Yadav made a minister out of Raja Bhai. I think that's a very bad signal. I'm not making a moral point. I think it's a really bad signal to send. And he's done precisely that. Now, the other way they got law and order under control was to put 8,500 policemen, retired policemen on the beat, contracting out police functions. Now, how many of you think that's a good idea, contracting out police functions?
Well, don't they do it in the US because most of the university police is contracted, isn't it?
That's true.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if your Bihar police isn't able to do the job, and if you're fighting a war with Naxals, and if you're short of experienced policemen, and you have these people from the CRPF, then you can certainly do that. So this was one of the things they did, law and order. Now the other big constraint was failure to activate public spending. Basically, let me ask you a question. Do you think corruption scandals? Do you think that corruption scandals have a chilling effect on propensity to spend? What is the relationship between corruption scandals and propensity to spend?
Propensity to?
Spend. Yeah, anyone want to jump? Take a shot at that? Yeah,
Would it be because that the taxes are the ones that are involved in most of the scams? When you basically are spending the money, you're basically paying some sort of tax, which will eventually you feel might be stolen by the very people that were supposed to protect it. Like
Yeah.
Government, for example.
Not quite. I mean, that's a good answer, but not quite. Basically, the point is when bureaucrats fear that they're going to have corruption investigations launched against them, they tend to stop spending. They don't want to take risks. And this is what happened in the fodder scam. The Bihar government shut down, basically. So what Nitish does is he reactivates public spending. And a signal, what he does is he puts key trusted collaborators in key positions, R.K. Singh in roads, Amir Subhani in personnel. These are big bureaucrats in Bihar, major ones. Amunda in law and order in home. And gives them autonomy. Then he decentralizes spending. So he reactivates spending down the line. And the third thing he does is, he basically begins to address the capacity problem. Now, before you can actually access a government media scheme like JNNURM, how many of you know what JNNURM is? What does it stand for?
Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal.
Perfectly right. PMGS1, what does that stand for?
Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak.
Good, okay, fantastic. Now, to access these programs, you have to do a detailed project report. The detailed project report requires some outsourcing because the Bihar government could not prepare these details. So basically, they outsource this to ILS, which is a fairly sophisticated group that can handle these things. All of these things led to a reactivation of public spending. And if you look at the numbers, what you see is major district roads refurbished between FY 07 and 09, 3,432 kilometers. Major infrastructure spending. Now, there are two other things I just like to point out here. Government showed a strong desire to engage with outsiders in the reform process. So it wasn't an isolated government. Now, one of the problems with Mayawati is UP. They didn't want to engage with the outside world. They were not engaging with the Planning Commission. They were not engaging with Jindal University. They were not engaging with the World Bank. Very isolated. And I think this is an important benefit that you see in Bihar. And then quite a few creative things happening in Bihar. Jankari, the telephone-based request system, Right to Public Service Act, and the Aapki Sarkar, Aapke Dwar program. How many of you know what the Aapki Sarkar, Aapke Dwar program is? Basically, yeah, anyone know?
Is it some TV program for people to get their ration?
It's not quite. Basically, if you go to some of the districts in Bihar, government didn't have a presence, and they were naturally infested. So what you do is you fortify an area, and in that area you put your ICDS, you put your NREG, you put your PDS, you put your PHC, you put your school, and you fortify it and protect it. And gradually you extend your way back into the hinterland. So the first Aapki Sarkar, Aapke Dwar fortified complex was introduced in Jehanabad. Now how many of you know what happened in Jehanabad 3 years ago? Jehanabad, and I've been inside the jail. Jehanabad is a place where they had locked up several Naxals 300 of them. And the jail was stormed, and they released all these guys. So, right there they put one of these complexes.
But the problem with Jehanabad has always sort of been that complex. 3 years ago is like a manifestation that stands out. But the thing is that with Jahanabad, it's always been an accident-infested area. So
no, I'm talking about the incident. But you're right, it's always been an accident area. And in fact,
the Kurmi Bumiyar
that's right.
Caches were gone.
One of the worst areas for that. Now, let me just move on. We've got 3 points here. We've got hyperactivity of the executive, we have prioritization, and we have a reactivation of, we have coordination across government. There's factors in reform processes. Now, let's talk a little bit about West Bengal. I don't want to sort of say too much. Now, I'm not looking at the Mamata period, I'm looking at the CPM period. And, you know, you'll be surprised to learn, I mean, there were major reforms, in my view, major reforms within the Marxist paradigm carried out in West Bengal. And these focused on 3 things. One is privatization of public sector enterprises, restructuring of the power sector, and, you know, some improvements in education, but those improvements didn't go anywhere, and for reasons that I will mention later. Now, here again, we can look at some of the strategies. Basically, the fact that the CPM had good relations with unions, relatively speaking, made it possible for them to control employees of public sector enterprises.
Sorry, you're seeing the period 2000 to 2010 onwards.
I'm looking at something, it starts around the mid-90s.
Mid-90s.
And goes till about 2007-8 is the data period. So basically what you have here is an attempt to close down some of these loss-making PSCs because the government is in a fiscal crunch. And thanks to unions, thanks to cajoling the employees and a VRS program, it's an expensive VRS program funded by the DFID. VRS is a voluntary retirement program to buy out employees. And these tend to be expensive precisely because you buy them out. It is expensive, but this worked. And you got 6,000 employees retired, which is no mean achievement. I mean, in West Bengal, it's no mean achievement. And from the point of view of the government's ready, it is significant. Just from a fiscal point of view. Now, the other thing is West Bengal power sector reform. Basically, the WSEB, the Electricity Board, the first thing they did was kick out the previous management, put in place a couple of generalist, technocratically oriented IAS officers. Generalist because they're IAS, technocratic because they had experience in the power sector prior to that. And rather than privatize and unbundle right away, which would have generated a huge amount of opposition, they sort of made incremental changes. Cut back on theft, collect dues from government partners that haven't paid, improve procurement processes, insist on employee attendance, design a performance measurement management system, tie those to incentives, bonuses, and things like that, and then proceed very late in the game to unbundling. So again, what you see here is a very interesting sequencing. And that's the point I want you to know. I'm not bothered whether you understand WSEB restructuring, but just this issue of sequencing and how that's linked to the political economy. Now, clearly, if you look at these 2 cases, the public sector enterprises and the power sector reform, context drove reforms. Unlike Andhra, where you have a large farmer lobby, West Bengal's agriculture is rain-fed. There is no fight over irrigation pump sets and the pricing of electricity based on IP sets. So it was relatively easy to resolve the power sector issue. You didn't have a farmer lobby to contend with. Ruling parties' influence with unions was key. And I think outsiders played an important role as well. Plus communication strategies, working with employees from the inside out. So now, you know, when I look back at Mamata Banerjee's Bengal and Buddha Dev's Bengal, I think Buddha Dev's Bengal was more reformist. To be honest with you, I think he was more reformist than Mamata Banerjee. Much more reformist. I think West Bengal today, despite Aman Mitra's presence as finance minister, is going nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. No, it's worse than the CPM, much worse. It's controversial, but that's my view.
Even prevented the CPM from reforming for the last 2 years.
Yeah.
last 3-4 years that they're doing.
No, I mean, it's you know, CPM made its own mistakes, but I think they tried pretty hard to get West Bengal back on the industrial map. Now, let me just jump into Gujarat. Now, here there's an element of path dependence in the reform story. Gujarat was a kind of entrepreneurial state even in the 60s. And you know, if you read Asima Sinha's book, one of the things you see is the Gujarati resident commissioner lobbying the government for production quotas. Something the West Bengal resident commissioner would never do. He would never deign to do that. And then when they got the production quotas, one of the things they did was create joint sector companies with private participation. Again, unheard of elsewhere. The other thing is capacity. The Gujarati state clearly has capacity. Capacity is, I'm using this in a very neutral sense. It's well coordinated, they monitor effectively, and they can make credible commitments. Now, capacity is a dark side. I mean, you can use the state to engage in pogroms, you can use the state to engage in attacks on minorities, you can also use the state for development. I'm using capacity right now in a very technical sense. Now, how capacity is used is a different issue. Now, with respect to Gujarat, I will focus on the infrastructure sector, where I think you have seen a tremendous sort of buoyancy. But again, as I pointed out, in the book, this is not necessarily because of Narendra Modi. This actually goes back a long, long way to the early 90s. And you could say Keshubhai Patel is as much the author of reform as Narendra Modi. And I mean, West Bengal's strategy, they managed to get rid of 14,000 textile employees through a VRS. That's the West Bengal paradigm. That's not really a structural reform. It fixes red ink issues and allows for fiscal consolidation, which releases budgets for capital expenditure, things like that. But the most important thing is really the port story. Now, if you look at ports, one of the things you notice is Gujarati politicians wanted to develop ports because they felt this would develop the hinterland. And it would also help them develop the power sector because you could import coal. And so the state said, all right, we're going to create a PPP framework, we're going to have rules, we're going to restructure the maritime board, trusted technocrats, we're going to put in charge of the maritime board, rather than these sort of low managerial structure that was in place. And you had a massive surge in port development. I mean, today, Gujarat funnels 2/3 of non-major port traffic, 1/3 of all cargo traffic. It's a remarkable story. And it has India's largest private port. And this intersects with the power development strategy. Now, this is entirely the result of collaboration between the private sector, the government, and a developmentalist emphasis. So, it's no mean achievement. Now, on power sector, they didn't do quite as well. But this power sector story highlights an issue of trial and error, learning from past mistakes, this kind of thing. In the late 1990s, the emphasis, like in Bombay, was on negotiating power purchase agreements. But these were negotiated at adverse rates. The electricity board went bankrupt. They owed about 2,000, they had a deficit of 2,000 crores, power deficit, in the early 2000s, which, thanks to the adoption of the West Bengal strategy, fixing the power sector internally first, before going to unbundling, i.e. cut back on theft, i.e. collect unrealized dues, improve procurement, and get into performance management. They were able to clear this to about 200 crores. And then they renegotiated the PPAs. After they cleaned up the sector. And then they moved on to unbundling. So, it's a sequencing structure. But one factor that needs to be pointed out is that the person who reformed the power sector was highly respected for her abilities and controlled the entire energy sector at a given time. She controlled the power department, Secretary of Energy, she was in charge of the Gujarat State Electricity Board, and she controlled the other energy systems. In case of the right person in the right position at the right time. Luck. Basically luck. How many of you have read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow? read it. It's a great book because what it suggests is that a lot of life is luck. And, you know, we think that, let's say someone scored really well in a tennis match today, or someone did really well in golf, and the next day the person drops down significantly. You might say, well, you know, the guy was set up for a fall. Or if they perform exceptionally well, you might say, well, you know, exceptional performance. Fact is, it's regression to the mean. And, you know, you have to track the mean over time. And there's a lot of unpredictability and noise in the system. And because there's unpredictability and noise, you luck out sometimes and other times you don't. You just luck. Good. You can't control it. You can't predict it. Now, let me just move on to the regulation story. Now, we've all, you know, telecom is a very interesting story because despite all the scams, telecom in India has been a success in terms of teledensity, in terms of the explosion of cell phones. And, you know, if you unravel the story, it's a story about the Prime Minister's office under Rajiv Gandhi and later Narasimha Rao and later Vajpayee getting involved and taking on vested interests in DT. And had they not done that, you wouldn't have had this explosion of private participation in the sector. That's one theme. The other theme is the Sukram scandal begins the process of creating an independent regulator. But there were still flaws in the system. The Raja scandal seems to me to have to do with two or three things. One is the Prime Minister's office ceased to have an activist role in the sector. Unlike the past, when things went well in the sector, they withdrew. And they ceded terrain to the Department of Telecom under Raja. Now, this might be Manmohan Singh's style. It might be, you know, related to other things. But you know, it does appear that the dynamics of coalition politics had something to do with this. The second thing is that the group of ministers, in its memorandum, has said that telecom pricing would be determined jointly by the MOF, Ministry of Finance, and the Department of Health. But it appears that the Finance Minister, after really pushing an auction, Chidambaram, unlike what Subramanian Swamy says, did push for an auction. For a long time he pushed for an auction. Then he drops his objections. We don't know why he dropped his objections. I'm not willing to judge him. I'm willing to say that he dropped his objections at some point after pushing for auctions for a long time. So we don't know what happened. Why did he drop his objections? There's a political, other motives we don't know. But in the end, and the TRI appears to have, at some level, supported this first come first serve policy, or didn't push the auction, which also raises questions about the economy of the TRI. So what you see in this crisis is the regulator coming under pressure, the PMO not playing a sort of appropriate stewardship role, and the telecom ministry being captured by a party and then by private interests linked to that party. But the history of the telecom sector shows that crises generate reforms. So I have a hunch that we'll come out with a stronger regulator, a clearer principle for bidding, and I think the telecom sector will resume its boom. So I don't, and in fact that boom is not stopped. So I would still say, so it's a very interesting sector. But if you compare it to ports, there is no story of PMO involvement in ports. It's a department of shipping story. Tariff authority of major ports has no role in port management, port licensing. All they do is set tariffs. And it appears that major ports are controlled largely by port trusts. And port trusts basically tend to be controlled by the government and unions. And so what do you do? A la North. Go back to Douglas North. All of you should read all of Douglas North's work if you want to understand public policy. The rules of the game are key. Let's go through some of these rules. You prolong cargo storage to push up demurrage charges. What is this? You encourage high bids from the private sector to encourage more royalties. And you don't use royalties, you don't allow companies to write off royalties in cost determination, thereby pushing up tariffs. and you have high vessel-related tariffs. The rule structure is against competition, it's against participation, it's against a bunch of things. So what has happened? People like Narendra Modi, Gujarat, they've just jumped into the void, and minor ports have become major ports. Major ports have become minor ports. That's maybe a little exaggerated, but that's broadly what is happening. And if you go back to the 50s, and I was talking to this wonderful old man who was a chief secretary in Orissa, and at the time, he was, in the 50s, he was director of Bharatni Port. And he was telling me, he said, you know, Vikram, when I was director of Bharatni Port, we went to see Gulzari Nanda, and we wanted to do, I think, the finance minister at the time, we wanted to develop ports, and they said, no, what is this Bharatni? Don't bother. Now, and so, Naveen Patnaik's father, Biju Patnaik, said, nothing doing, we're going to push port development. They built Paradip, and then they went to the government and said, now here it is. Will you notify it as a major port? Notify. So basically, these are entrepreneurs. The Gujarati leadership was entrepreneurial. Orissa's leadership under Biju Patnaik was entrepreneurial. And it didn't matter what the constitutional framework said. It didn't matter what he said in the major port. You just move forward. So, now, why do you think the Prime Minister's office hasn't pushed port reform? I mean, it's a strange thing because 70% of your trade, in terms of value, is through ports. 95% in terms of volume. Why do you think they've not taken on the port sector? Any theories, thoughts? I mean, it seems like a critical sector, I mean, to attack. I mean, why can't we have a port sector that works in Dubai or Singapore? We could create Singapore, no problem. Any ideas? Swagato.
Right from the Mughal days, it was never seen. Even the Gujarat port, in the Mughal at the time, if you read Pearson, he says the port was given to the East India Company because they wanted to rule on the land.
Right.
So for the Nawab, it was land was more important than the port. So that's how the lease for the given for the sea access.
Fundamental underestimation of the importance of the sea, historically grounded. Now this, I'm not sure I agree with you, Asim, but you know that certainly is one of the explanations for Mughal neglect of sea power. Like, the Mughals are fundamentally land power. But does that hold today?
Yeah. His thesis is that you are the king, you are ruling the land, you are not ruling the sea for a Mughal India.
In the 1990s, reform broke out everywhere, and yet it takes 2 weeks for a ship to offload in India and leave. In fact, to get a berth itself will take 10 to 12 days. Ship is standing out at high sea for 10 to 12 days before it can get a berth.
Yes, exactly.
So unions are controlling the whole process. And why is the government reforming everything from 91 but not reforming the most crucial sector? Whereas if you see Jebel Ali, which is built by Dubai in 1970s, there was actually no need for Jebel Ali to be built. And everybody said, you're mad, you're building such a high capacity port which can accommodate 4 super tankers. But they went ahead and built it. And today their capacity is full. In fact, the capacity has been full now for 20 years. Jebel Ali has been working at full capacity to build a new port. So why did they not, in 91 when they were reforming everything, it's a mystery, I don't know.
It is a mystery. If you would take on DOD, why can't you take on ports?
I have a theory. I mean, going forward with Asim's assumption that, you know, I mean, here my mindset is that land is more important. Now, for the benefits to ports to come in, I assume, going by what you said, that there's a lot of private involvement in ports. So if the government tries to engage with that, they have to do with a lot of, I mean, they'll have to combat a lot of things, rent seeking and everything. Whereas, and the reforms won't be visible in that 5-year term if they do something with respect to land. That would be more visible to the public at hand, and so it's a bit electoral politics also.
No, I think that's an interesting point. I'm not sure I have to study that more closely to say whether I agree with you or not. But I think it's an interesting point. Is there something about ports that is not very, attractive from an electoral calculus or a political calculus? After all, telephones, every Indian has a cell phone. That certainly is attractive politically. But I don't think that is the issue of telecom either. I think Rajiv Gandhi, Indira Gandhi saw this as a security issue. They thought that if India could develop its telecom backbone, it could compete as an economic superpower. And I think this was heightened by Vajpayee. So I think there was a strategic sense, something strategic got involved with telecom. Ports, I don't think this has happened, but it's a real mystery to me. And, I should say...
Is it also because if you open up port, then you also open up your economy to the international competition and possibly with imports and other things, which is much more. So then you have the local traders or manufacturers getting threatened by that?
I mean, it might be resistance from non-exporting manufacturers. It might be lack of pressure from exporters. It might be the fact that that port trusts have a lot of power. That in fact you would run into trouble with trade unions. It might have to do with the left participation in the previous government. You know, this is something that we should actually investigate.
I think the answer is much more simpler.
Yeah.
It exists in most governmental organizations.
Yeah.
It's called the tyranny of status quo.
Yeah.
Because there were unions in ports which were much more rapid, and in case of unionization, they are much more connected to the politicians. So they want the status quo. The government wants the status quo to be, as you mentioned, like development norms, just taken in India. Right man at the right place at the right time. So in case of ports, it wasn't pushed by the right people because they didn't have those connections. They didn't need to break the degree of status quo because everything was politically for them feasible.
I should say that government has reformed the customs to quite an extent.
Has reformed
The customs system. You know, so
but that's the basis of your structural agricultural policies.
yeah, exactly. But they haven't moved on to the actual physical restructuring of the port sector. And there's something happening, but not.
I have an instrumental answer. I don't think that's the correct answer.
Please, Asim, yeah.
In the functional sense, it might be also, even there's a willing officer sitting there in the ministry trying to push this reform. It might be also because too many ministries are in charge of the port. There's a security issue there, there is a commerce issue there, then there's a whole lot of things.
No, I think that is a labor issue.
That's why I'm coming to that. There's several ministries which are involved in opening this, unlike telecom.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah.
I think that's a very good point because you have to get a cross-ministerial kind of agreement on it.
Home Ministry is also sitting on the top of the port. You can't open the port without the Home Ministry's permission.
Yeah.
So there's a
But
lot of.
how does Gujarat then get ahead on this? This is the question.
Sorry?
How does Gujarat break through this? I mean, compared to the other states, not that Gujarat is a paragon or efficiency,
Yeah.
compared to the other states in India, its ports seem to be functioning better. So how does he do it? That's the point you mentioned. That depends on the politicians at power. If they are entrepreneurial in nature, they can open it for themselves. If the guy is not entrepreneurial, then he won't do it. So that's what
And also the Gujarat was able to attract significant private investment into ports. There was a sense of linkage to hinterland development effects.
I think it's because Gujarat has a proximity to North India, and that's my.
Is North India?
Yeah, Gujarat is the entry point for North Indian trade. So the hinterland of UP, Bihar, Punjab, etc., Delhi. So Gujarat has a much bigger, for example, compared to say Odisha, or compared to Kerala, or say compared to Tamil Nadu.
Yeah.
The distance you will have to truck goods in. So this
They have a huge incentive
incentive
to develop ports. And let's go back to historical port dependence. I can cite Surat as you did and say, well, Surat was, after that is certainly not modern, not medieval Gujarat, but certainly there's a long history of the importance of ports in that region. And let's not let me add another point: the competition with Maharashtra. This idea that Gujarat is competing with Maharashtra. And certainly so far they've won that competition. Now, let me move on to the JNURM case, where essentially the point we want to make here is that centrally sponsored schemes have different outcomes depending on context, absorption capacity, and things like that. So the way a centrally sponsored scheme works on the ground depends primarily on local factors. So, you know, we took a sample we took 3 cities, Bangalore, Ahmedabad and Patna. And what we found was that in Patna, JNURM had effects mostly on the policy structure. They reformed, they got rid of the Urban Land Seeding Regulation Act. They cut stamp duties. They went for rainwater harvesting. They improved the process for obtaining building permissions. All of that. But when it came down to actually implementing projects, governance projects in the urban sector, they lagged behind. Why? Because of capacity problems. So, they moved to double entry accounting, for instance, which is a JNURM milestone. They couldn't do it because they didn't have trained accountants, lack of trained accountants. Constant transfers of municipal officials. So there was a lot they couldn't do. Now, in places like Karnataka and Gujarat, Ahmedabad, Patna, and Ahmedabad, Bangalore, there was high absorption of these funds. But actually the reforms were fairly small because most of the reforms under JNURM had actually been implemented long before the program. So, Karnataka computerized property registration as early as property tax collection as early as 2000. K. Jairaj was the person who did that. Things like Ultra had been repealed in Karnataka in 1999. So many of these reforms were actually passé, but they could use the funds, they could absorb the funds. And the other lesson is that where state government didn't want to cooperate, the central government could do nothing to gain any money. So for instance, one of the exhortations of JNURM is deliver services through ULBs, urban local bodies. Karnataka does it through parastatals, UWSSB, through water, and this kind of thing. And parastatals, the perception was they were doing a fairly good job. And so state government said, look, we don't back this up. We're not going to decentralize. What we will do is we'll have, performance agreements between municipalities and these parastatals. But we're not going to agree to, decentralized services to ULBs. Sorry. Now, Gujarat, same thing. They abolished octroi, but they didn't replace it with anything. So you have very weak financial foundation for the ULBs. And they didn't bother to replace that. They didn't bother to strengthen the financial bases of cities because they knew that that would erode state power over cities. So, again, you can see the importance of state ownership and over the success of these programs, where you have a convergent framework. The programs tend to work well, state governments and central government working in tandem. When they're at cross purposes, the program basically doesn't achieve its objective. So you can't, by fiat, impose things. You just can't. And that's the problem with centrally sponsored schemes is that they're fundamentally a political tool to assert central government control in state governments. And even condition state governments to do things in areas that really belong to the state government list. Condition that contingent on the flow of centrally sponsored scheme. But this model doesn't work. It's a good model from a political economy perspective. If you're a central government trying to control unruly federation, it's a lousy model to push development. There are too many steps. Funds flow is too complex. Planners don't have enough information on how programs are doing, and there's a lot of leakages all along the complex flow of funds chain. Now, let me just conclude with a couple of points. I mentioned homegrown ideas. Now, in the literature, one example of best practice in public administration is executive agencies. You shield the state, you shield the service delivery function from political interference by separating the policymaker and the provider. You create a kind of executive agency. Delhi Metro Corporation is sort of an executive agency, which is why it's done well. But you could say it's an executive agency by accident because of the personality of Sridharan, the first chairman, because of the fact that it was a project that had a lot of political buy-in, because of the fact that it was controlled both by the Delhi government and by the central government, so that you could maneuver between them, this sort of thing. So, that's not an executive agency by design, it's an executive agency by accident.
It's also by performance.
And performance.
Sridharan performs.
He performs typically.
Once he performs, he becomes the sort of dictator of
Absolutely. That's a very good point. Now, but if you read the literature, if you trawl through the literature on executive agencies in Japan and New Zealand, this is a mantra, have an executive agency. It hasn't taken off in India because basically politicians don't want to surrender power. We have a very mixed history with societies and boards, which are sort of pale reflections of executive agencies. And they haven't worked very well. In fact, they fall between, you're trying to correct one problem, you create another problem. You give them more autonomy, yet they're more prone to corruption outside the general fiscal frame. So, we have a very mixed record on this. And so this model didn't go anywhere. On the other hand, right to information, again, there are about 100 plus countries that have RTI laws today. It's taken off here. Why? Because it was a long journey relating to RTI in India, going back to, I would say it started in the late 70s. The Rajarai versus the Rajarai case, where the Supreme Court ruled that this is a fundamental right. And then you get into the Bhopal gas tragedy, where environmentalists get into RTI issues. Then you get into BOFAs. And then you get into state acts in the 90s. Aruna Roy's MKSS movement and social audits. And then the Supreme Court intervenes to say, well, you should have an RTI law when the BJP is involved. And then finally they do it with the support of the National Advisory Council. So it's a long trajectory, 25 years, 30 years of arguing about transparency. And very, very strong a set of NGOs pushing it. And in the end, ownership by all major actors. So, this is certainly something that takes off because it's home grown. So, there's a lot to think about here. I'll just conclude by saying that, reforms actually, the ability to push reforms depends on a real understanding of the context. You have to understand the context, but you shouldn't be a slave of the context. So, you need to know where you want to go. But to do that, you need to understand the context without becoming its slave. Because if you're a slave of the context, then you favor the status quo, basically. You can't really impose reform from the outside. It has to be homegrown. Yet outside perspectives are essential. Reform processes are complex and unpredictable. You start in one direction, you may end up being blown off course into another quite different direction. So there's an element of unpredictability. You don't know where you're going when you start the path. You think you know, but people, opposition gets activated, support gets activated, new situations come into being with different equilibria of interests. And very soon you might be somewhere where you didn't expect to be. Now, in India at least, incremental change has been the most successful reform strategy. I should say that, though, we can have to balance this. Incremental change, yes, but all this takes place post-1991, where you have seismic shifts. The end of India's relationship with the Soviet Union, in the sense of being a kind of de facto sort of close relationship with Russia. That changes India, rebalances its foreign policy. That's a big change. A shift in the emphasis of economic policy, major change. And a move from one-party systems to coalition arrangements, major change. So these are mega changes. And within those mega changes, you have incremental changes with respect to policy reform and institutional reform. So, it's incremental, yet it's also seismic. And never underestimate the importance of ideas and talking in reform. Because people do listen to ideas, and eventually things get through. Finally, anyone who comes in with a blueprint of reform and says you should just do this, it'll work, doesn't really understand reform. So beware of blueprints. Blueprints are just suggestive, they're not sort of ideal, they're not really sort of something to be taken too seriously.
Equally true of China as well.
Yeah.
Because in 79, they turns out to be successful.
Yeah, exactly.
And incrementally, he doesn't know whether the white mice will catch the.
Okay, we'll just have about maybe just 5-10 minutes.
As long as you rush, yes.
And after that, any questions from Nilesh? We'll just take 2-3 questions together. Nilesh, anyone else?
If there's nothing, then I have a question.
Yeah, okay. And any hands? Show of hands? No? Okay.
So could you throw some light on the reforms in the mining sector?
On
the mining sector.
Okay, mining sector. Shall I take these one at a time?
Yeah.
Or should we just ask a few questions?
Yeah, just Nilesh.
Yeah, I have. I have 3 questions to choose to answer any one. First of all, this you stressed the importance of engagement with private individuals if there is free state development. But
did I just stress private individuals?
Private entities, for example, engage with outside entities.
Outside, it's not necessarily private. It could be the Planning Commission, it could be the World Bank, it could be Jindal School. Yeah. I just want to clarify that.
Okay, all right, because that would sort of turn down one of my questions. I was going to ask you about how rent seeking plays into that and how that would affect state governments. My second question is, I want to ask the second question is, with regard to decentralization, doesn't that send a positive message that the government is firmly entrenched and therefore doesn't mind letting go of some of the power that it actually has? And that sends a positive, that actually is very positive for electoral purposes as such, and therefore kills 2 birds with 1 stone.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Yeah. Since we've been broadly speaking about growth, what is your view about calculation of green GDP and that as an indicator of growth? as opposed to these two.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks Vikram, thanks for this excellent talk. Basically, see, if I just try to make a summary of the...
Sure.
Very short, I'll just do not more than 2 minutes, I can't speak more also. So it's basically unevenness of the reform. Why the one state prospers and another state doesn't prosper. And you're not new, but in the sense that I just take 2 examples of the literature. One is Atul Kohli and Asima Sena analysis on the social base of the literature or political base of the literature. The other is the whole Peter Evans story of state embeddedness. So the point which I am trying to find in this particular talk, see, there is a historical basis for why certain states are able to integrate themselves with the reform and why states are not able to integrate themselves with the reform. And if we see this whole discussion in isolation with the historical process, I am not talking about 100 years or 200 or 300 year history, I am talking about the contemporary India history, why Gujarat is more integrated with the market reforms than for Bihar, of West Bengal or UP or Karnataka, whatever it is. So if you extrapolate this lecture on a historical plane, a long-term plane, how will you see this as? Because this is a very short-term thing and which gives a very instrumental analysis that a conscious political leader, if he does this will happen. But you know better than me that this doesn't happen. Output A will not result, input A will not result in output B.
Very good.
Thank you.
Excellent question. Any more questions?
Yeah,
I have a question regarding the World Bank policy on land acquisition, because I've been recently reading about the Mumbai 2020 building up of new infrastructure in Mumbai. So when the World Bank is sponsoring this kind of projects, so there are strict rules on land acquisition, and even people without unregistered or legally owning the land has to be compensated if the project is funded by World Bank. So this puts an immense pressure on the state exchequer. So how do you...
Okay, I'll answer a few of these and we can go for another round if you want. The mining sector question is so you asked a very broad question. What are the reforms in mining sector? And I don't have a whole lot to say about that. What I can say is that it has a lot. I mean, if you talk to Santosh Hegde, and if you look at Santosh Hegde's report on illegal mining in Karnataka, what you see is a strong connection between mining, the issue of illegal mining and political party funding. And so I mean, I think that's something that you have to bear in mind. You also see the relationship. This seems to take off with the demand for iron ore in China soaring in the early 2000s, and there's a lot of I don't know if you talk to Santosh Hegde, what he'll tell you is that you have the iron ore, but you also have fines, which is a kind of dust. And the Chinese have developed a technique to actually process fines, and so this unleashed a kind of search for fines and iron ore, legal and illegal, for export to China, and everybody was in it. I mean, those who had mining licenses, those who did not have mining licenses, transporters, politicians, customs officials, even people who ran ports were involved, Mangalore and things like that. So you're struck at the reach of this and the inability of the government of India to do a whole lot to stop it. And essentially, and you can analogize this to say Hyderabad, Uttarakhand, where the previous government basically, particularly under Pokhriyal, really pushed licensing people who were, to do small hydro projects, run-of-the-river projects, and totally unqualified. Breweries from Chandigarh were getting licenses to play with the Ganga and extract, create small run-of-the-river projects, essentially raping Uttarakhand and its hydro resources. And these seem to be governments that come to power with an insatiable lust for money and lots of political debts to pay off. And they just grab whatever resources available and extract what they can. And certainly that's the story in Uttarakhand. I mean, these people who go to Uttarakhand, it was, I think, 2 districts of UP. So you get small time politicians suddenly becoming ministers and MLAs and MPs. And they just can't resist. They can't resist. I mean, that's to me the Uttarakhand story. And the central party leaderships in both states, Uttarakhand and Karnataka, happen to be BJP, but you would say Congress in Goa. Quiet. They said absolutely nothing. So, that's on the mind.
So, can I just ask something?
Yeah.
I think I'll just, because I'll take a 3 minutes to tell my point, so forget it.
Rent seeking in private sector. I mean, as I said, I think the issue of rent seeking applies to everybody. Private sector, public sector. I don't think anyone is holier than thou. And certainly the 2G scandal shows the rapacity of the private sector. Certainly the real estate developers who got these licenses and then resold them. Clearly that is utterly shocking. Again, it's got something called Uttarakhand, right? A brewery getting a run-of-the-river license to develop a small hydropower project on the Ganga. Totally unqualified. A real estate fellow who's linked to the DMK getting a license, a 2G license, which he then sells to, squeaky clean Norwegian companies, then utterly shocked when they find out that the Supreme Court has invalidated this. So it's the same kind of rubbish. And, India is not going to be able to go get anywhere unless we stop this. You can't keep doing this till the cows come home. Eventually, there will be serious consequences. The loss to the exchequer from this 2G scandal. And, we're now saying that, we have the budget deficit, this, that, and the other. Well, manage your resources better. Have a proper auction, price discovery. You may not have such a large fiscal deficit. So, fine. Eventually, there are laws of economics. You have this fiscal deficit, deal with inflation, deal with currency depreciation. Go ahead and deal with it. Screw your exporters. Continue to lag behind in NDGs. Okay. Nobody is saying it. Nobody is saying it. So, on decentralization, what did you mean by decentralization? You talking about decentralization at the local level or to the states?
That point you made about the center in the state, center it's a good way for the center to sort of assert its power as far as the state. But doesn't the benefit sort of directly go to the state? Because what they're seeing is, what the people see at the end is reforms, and they see the people who are there in the states at the head. For example, the chief minister and his cabinet who are visible, and they associate those reforms with these people.
Yeah, I mean, the smaller the scale, the more likely you get people enthused.
Yeah.
And reform, some reforms happen at the central level, like economic policy. Other reforms, institutional reforms particularly, happen at the local and state levels.
So, my question was, why this apathy to, apathy towards decentralization? It would send a positive message saying that the government is secure in its voters.
No, I think it's just a power question. I don't think central governments anywhere want to surrender power if they can avoid it. So, now green GDP, I mean, certainly that's, GDP, the conventional definition has many flaws. And, if you were to do a green accounting, you might come up with very different numbers. I don't have the skills to do that kind of green accounting. I'll leave that to you and others. But certainly your point is well taken. There's something about long-term what? Or the long-term issue, the long-term historical past dependence. Now, the thing is, if you look at global history and long-term cycles, all these short-term analyses look rather thin. And, I'm not a historian, so I can't, I'm taking deliberately truncated slices of time and looking at that through a lens within a certain period of reform. And, that I guess has its limits. Yes, I agree with that. But on the other hand, I'm not sure what to do about it. We're stuck with this for the time being. Now, WB policy on land acquisition, I don't know enough about the WB policy on land acquisition. It's a very strict policy, with full compensation and all kinds of things. And, state governments have to comply with it if they're going to get our funds. So,
No, World Bank for World Bank.
When we do a project, there's a full rehabilitation package and voluntary consent and various kinds of things. So, but I'm not an expert on this, so I prefer not to comment. I don't know enough about it.
Sorry, we have to rush through it, and extremely sorry for that. And again, very, very, it was an excellent presentation, and thank you very much for coming here.
Thanks, Thanks.